Hey guys, Brian here from Starlite Pulp. Thanks for checking in today. And our the author we've got on the Pulpcast today is Mr. John McNally, and so he has actually two books out this year, or essentially this year, late last year and this year. And one is the Book of Ralph, which was actually put out quite a while back, but this is a new version that has a whole bunch of, I think, 150 something like that extra pages, and it's an anniversary edition. So we're going to talk about that for sure. And then the Pin Butterfly came out in late 23, and it is a kind of a noir thriller. John, how you doing today, man?
Hey, great, man. Thanks for having me. It's a long time coming.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, it's funny because John and I have been talking about making this happen for probably about 6 months now, but for any number of reasons, there have been a number of reschedulings and other things. So talk to me a little bit about the Book of Ralph. Obviously, this is a book that is near and dear to your heart. It's something that you started a long time ago with these stories, and the feedback on it has been tremendous. The reviews are excellent. But this is the 20th anniversary edition. So talk to me a little bit about the original Book of Ralph, but then how this one's different and kind of the transition there.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just tell you what it's about first, which is it's set in the south side of Chicago, southwest side of Chicago, where I grew up, blue collar neighborhood, set in 1978, with the main characters in eighth grade, which is when I was in eighth grade. So
Right.
pattern here. And it's about a friendship between kind of self-proclaimed B plus student whose name is Hank, who's the narrator, who's befriended by this kid who had failed both the third and the fifth grades in grade school, and has a reputation of being a troublemaker.
Right.
And I wrote it originally and it's a coming of age story, really.
Sure.
Um,
Like
but
a Bildungsroman.
yeah, exactly. And I started it first as just some short stories as early as 1993. And I had written a couple of short stories, and it was really it was a breakthrough for me, because every time before that, when I tried to write anything that was close to where I'd grown up, or anything that resembled my life, it was very maudlin. It was very I would also focus on the wrong things. I kind of focus more on kind of the socioeconomics of the area
Uh-huh.
instead of the characters. And so when I finally made that kind of switch that in my head, it kind of opened up this world, because then I had this. It was definitely more about the characters, but all of that other stuff became kind of subtext.
Sure.
And I just enjoyed writing about them. It was kind of like this. So occasionally it would be like some rumor, some absurd rumor that I had heard when I was in grade school, and then I would kind of build a story around that, or incidents or places that I would go when I was in grade school. And so my first book was a short story collection called Troublemakers. It came out in 2000, and three of the stories featuring these characters were in it. But I love the characters so much that I continued writing them until I got to a point where I thought, I have a book's worth of stories here,
Right.
but I honestly didn't think anybody would be interested in a following a short story collection with another short story collection.
Yeah.
But
And short story collections are notoriously hard to publish. So yeah, I'm sure.
it just seemed like a bad move all around. But I ended up I got an agent interested in it. She read it overnight, sent it to an imprint of Simon and Schuster. Within 3 days, I had a 2-book contract, and I thought, "Holy shit! Like, is this how?"
Right. Is this how it works?
Yeah. Well, I had like two other books that had been two other novels I'd written that had gotten rejected, and had been. I was 34 years old.
Mhm.
Or no, I guess at that time I was older. 34 was when I got my first book accepted. So this is like 37 or so. And I just thought, wow, I was just exhausted at that point, but also kind of elated.
Sure.
And the book got way more attention than I thought. It was marketed. We ended up, I talked about this with the marketing people, where it was like first marketed kind of in that vein where it just says stories, or no, it just says fiction, a fiction on the cover.
Uh-huh.
And And then by the time the paperback came out, it was marketed as a novel. So over the years, though, I continued writing more stories featuring these characters, but not really with an intention of doing anything with them or
Sure.
putting another book. I just liked the characters. And last year, my on Facebook, the Facebook page for my hometown, every once in a while somebody would pop up and say, "Hey, have you heard about this book, The Book of Ralph? It's set in Burbank. I just ran across it." Well, last year somebody did that, wrote that asking people if anybody knew what had happened to me. And the first comment was that I'm sorry to report, but he died. And I thought, well, maybe I need to like bring this book back out, and because it's gone different. And that's what kind of inspired me in some ways. I mean, I left a comment saying, the rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
Right, right.
But yeah, and then I spent the next year just kind of compiling those stories, kind of re-editing,
Uh-huh.
the slightly editing the original version, adding 150 pages of stories, and then adding an introduction that just kind of talked about the journey of writing the Book of Ralph.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So something you mentioned in there, two things actually, but first off, that you mentioned in that answer that I thought was interesting was you mentioned how originally you were writing about kind of the socioeconomics of the area, and then when it changed to more character driven, all of a sudden you found that there was really something there. And I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago at the 29 Palms Book Fest. And we were talking about that actually it was a writing crime fiction panel, and we were talking about the differences that writers have in terms of some are theme or plot driven and some are more character driven. Myself personally, I know that for me it's all about the characters. It all starts with the characters. I work the rest of the shit out as it goes, but it's character driven. But I know everybody's different, and for some people it works differently. So just touch on that real quick and see if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, the stories I'd written before that were definitely character driven. My favorite
Mm.
kind of writers are writers who are character driven. Um, I think it was really just writing about something that was so close to me and so close to my life
Hmm.
that I couldn't really see the forest for the trees. I lived in trailer parks and apartments, grew up in trailer parks and apartments and things like that. So my memory was, it's like, oh, I need to really capture this place. But instead, I'm capturing all the kind of gritty details and the circumstances surrounding it, all these kind of uh, tangential things ultimately to the story. But then, when I began tapping into this character who was in grade school, it as a kid, I was kind of aware of the circumstances I had grown up in, but because I hadn't experienced anything else, it
Sure.
wasn't at the forefront of my thoughts.
Yeah.
I was a kid out on my bike causing trouble. So
Yeah.
uh, once I made that shift to that kid and began kind of really drawing on my own experiences, but also making him his own character, then all the socioeconomic stuff is there, but it comes up in kind of small ways here and there.
Sure.
See it more through like the parents' points of view, or not their points of view, but when they appear in the scene and you see the interaction between the main character and his parents in terms of how stressed the parents are or whatever.
Right.
But the kid really doesn't make a lot of acknowledgement of it, and I think that seemed more accurate. I think to my own experience, like I was aware, but not as aware.
Right. Right. And then the other thing I want to bring up, and this is for everybody watching, this is for any writer watching anywhere. The other thing I want to bring up that John said in his first answer that I thought was so great is that he had put out a Book of Ralph. He put it out. It was done. But he continued writing stories about these characters because he just liked the characters. And that's the thing. A lot of people will sit down and they'll immediately think, where can I sell this? What can I do with this? Right. But at the end of the day, writers write. You know what I mean? We just, it doesn't, you don't have to have a plan for it. It just you do it. It's organic. You want to write about this character. It's a fun situation. What would happen if I put him here, And that kind of thing. I love that answer because a lot of people are so focused on the where can I get this published, right? Where can I send this off to? What am I going to do with this? And a lot of the really good stuff that gets written, you don't know when you're doing it. Kind of like, and correct me if I'm wrong. I might be totally off base here, but with the story you submitted to the fourth review, right? Nothing to worry about. It kind of sounded like when we were first talking about that, it kind of sounded like you didn't really know where to send that or what to do with it. You just thought it was an interesting story, and I'm like, yeah, send it over, But yeah, the point here I'm trying to make is just write. Don't worry about the marketability issues. Don't try to be James Patterson with it. Just write your story, right?
Yeah, I mean the thing is like you never know, and you never know. Like for the actual a little bit more of the backstory with the Book of Ralph was that after I wrote my book Troublemakers, I actually tried my first stab at writing a crime novel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I had an agent at that time who was really supportive of the book, and so when I sent her the first 200 pages, and I think this was kind of like a strategic error, but she wanted to send those 200 pages out to a bunch of editors. And almost all the editors are like, well, we don't know this guy. We don't know if he could like bring this together. We don't know. So she was trying to sell it before the thing was done. But because I was getting negative feedback, and also because I'm not sure that I was able to kind of bring it to a close because
sure.
plotting at least then wasn't my strong suit at all. I began working on those Ralph and Hank stories, and I kept telling her, I kept showing them to her, and she's like, well, those, it sounds, they're fun stories, but I don't think I can sell them. And the third time she told me that, I just fired her because I was like having such a good time writing the stories. And I thought,
sure,
I'm going to write this without any expectation that anybody's going to publish it.
Sure. Yeah.
Anybody.
Yeah. And that was kind of my point. That's the thing is you just got to write. You just got to do it. If somebody takes it and if it, then goes on to win, being America's best stories or whatever, great. But that should never be the point. Just sit there and do what you do, get the voice out that you have to write about. And that's what's awesome. So let's so I want to transition here real quick into we've got the Book of Ralph. And Book of Ralph is obviously it's a bildungsroman. It's about adolescence, and it's really cool that you write about adolescence well, because I think very few authors do that. King does it, actually. Stephen King, he's written a bunch, whether it's Stand By Me or any number of other ones, Joyland and a bunch of others. But he does a really good job with that and has for a long time. But I think a lot of writers struggle with writing about being a kid. It's one thing to remember it. It's quite another to bring a whole world to life based on it. And obviously you do that well. But then we move to The Pin Butterfly, which you put out last year, and this is obviously a very different story, right? So talk to me about The Pin Butterfly a little bit.
So The Pin Butterfly, it's set in Thailand, and the main story is it's an ex-cop who goes on an anniversary trip with his wife, and they're not really getting along. And while they both have jet lag, he wanders out into the city. It's called Patong. He wanders out into Patong, and he begins seeing different things, and he starts making assumptions about what he's seeing. And he starts thinking that there's some sex trafficking going on and other things. And he just out of both his jet lag and the situation with his wife, he just allows himself to get deeper and deeper into this, making a lot of wrong assumptions, but then also teaming up with other people who are seeing the same things. There's a woman who dropped out of law school. She's in her 20s. She's an American. They team up. There's an ex Navy SEAL who's dying, who's come to Thailand to die. He becomes part of the story, and so they all it's kind of this team of like trying to figure out what happens.
Sure.
And yeah, so I mean that's the main story of it.
Yeah. Okay. And you are correct me if I'm wrong, because normally anytime somebody puts a book in a completely foreign area, I always ask, what research did you do essentially? But from what I understand, you actually are quite familiar with Thailand. So why don't you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the probably about 8 years ago, I began kind of researching places to potentially retire.
Hmm.
Like with like, I mean, at that time, I had like my life was kind of a wreck in terms of like a lot of financial things. I'd
Sure.
recently got divorced. I had a house I couldn't sell in North Carolina, and I was just kind of tired of everything. And so the thing was is that other than Canada, I hadn't been out of the country.
Hmm.
But once I began typing in criteria in terms of like places that you could retire, places that are affordable, and a handful of other things, Thailand kept popping up. And honestly, I didn't know much about Thailand at all.
Hmm.
And then maybe about a year later, I just on a whim just booked a trip, 6 weeks, and I went there, fell in love with it immediately, and I've been back about 3 times. I guess I've been there 4 or 5 times now, along with other countries in Southeast Asia. But I just loved it. But the second time I was there was when I began. I'd also brought some Graham Greene novels with me.
Hmm.
I was reading Graham Greene while I was in Thailand,
Sure.
and something kind of clicked for me. I mean, I love crime fiction. I had tried to write that crime novel 20 years earlier,
Right.
and I had actually spent the last 10 years writing a lot of screenplays, either as work for hire or as a development deal or having things optioned. And a lot of those were
Okay.
crime. So I
Okay.
felt like better at plotting. But once I read Graham Greene, it kind of came together for me in terms of just it's like, oh, here's a guy who's writing about these different countries with some intrigue and something happening. And
Yep. Yep.
his books are a little bit of my book's definitely more of a thriller, and his
Hmm.
book is a little bit of a sleight of hand. There's the intrigue, but then there's also the love
Right.
story.
Right.
Um, but but it just clicked for me in terms of like how to write about another country and how to kind of think about um, think about a bunch of books kind of in that vein for myself. Just because it's like I have drafts of a couple more crime novels and they're both set in Southeast Asia, different
Okay.
places. One that's set in different countries throughout Southeast Asia. So yeah, it kind of opened up something for me that reading Graham Greene during it.
Okay. And so talk to me. So you just, as soon as you just mentioned what you just mentioned, my little, my spidey sense went off. Because I'm always talking to writers about how they prepare for things and how they organize what it is they're going to write. Just a couple weeks ago on one of the other panels, we talked about this at length in terms of writers. And so you just said you have a couple drafts, and I'm certainly not going to ask you about the drafts. That's not the point. But um, when you put together a draft like that, what does that look like? Is it 4 pages of notes? Is it a 25-page outline? Is it a James Ellroy 300-page outline? It's what would you consider a draft like that to look like?
A draft for me is the complete novel.
Okay.
So yeah, so each of those are about 350, 400 pages, and but one of them is that I the one that takes place in multiple countries. I feel like I need to go back to those countries to
Hmm.
kind of vent my experience.
I'll bet. Yeah.
Even though I always try to write from an outsider's experience because I'm not trying to be an expert in the country. So it's easier for me to say like, oh, here's a guy who's on an anniversary trip who doesn't know anything about Thailand. It's like, well,
Exactly. Yeah.
that person does.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but I do feel like I need to go back. And yeah, I try to write straight through as much as I can so that I can have like an entire working draft. And I
Okay.
try to quickly, even though the revision process may take me a year or 2 years.
And so, but when you do that, before you start writing,
Yeah,
let's say your outline or your notes, brainstorming, whatever it might be. What does that look like?
that's so. So I used to just wing it. And I realized over the years that I need some sort of sense of movement. Like especially for a thriller, even though I know it's going to change, I know things are going to morph into other things. I know I'm going to get rid of characters, all kinds of different things that are going to
Yeah.
happen. But that's where screenwriting actually came in handy for me, where it's like
Okay.
because I don't wing a screenplay. I usually have
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a three-act structure. I have a sense of where things are going to be moving. I'm moving towards something. And once I began doing that for the thriller at least with the Pin Butterfly, I had in my head kind of like a five-act structure, I think, kind of very loosely in
Okay.
terms of like the movement that I wanted the book to take. Um, and then once I had that, then I don't want to know too much because I also like the element of surprise. And I always feel like it's that Flannery O'Connor line. It's like the thing that surprised me. It's in Good Country People when the character, the Bible salesman, steals the wooden leg. She says, I didn't know that was going to happen until about two sentences before it happened. And the reason it's surprising or shocking to the reader is because it was shocking to me. So I
Yeah.
like to keep that part open enough so that I can have some flexibility where something happens and I think, wow, that takes this into a kind of a different direction.
Sure. Yeah,
Um,
100%. I mean, I know that when I'm writing, I oftentimes have um I write fairly loosely in the sense that I have an idea of what I want to get out of that scene, but I don't always know the way it's going to get there. And I kind of let the characters do what it is they're going to do based on how I think they would be acting. And so it's one of those things where I think a lot of people who are starting out in writing or who are not writers think we have like this very detailed plan where everything's going to happen. And honestly, I mean, the character develops as I'm writing them. You know what I mean? Sometimes they surprise me with what they do. So,
yeah, and short stories, I don't really plan. I mean, I kind of like to have a general. At some point, I want to know where it's heading, but I that just to me just organically kind of creates itself. So like the story "Nothing to Worry About"
mhm.
in Starlight Pulp. I mean, that was I had an incident that had happened when I was just having a little cancer spot removed on my face. That like
Yeah.
the exchange that I had with the surgeon while it was happening was so weird to me
Right.
that I for years thought about it, and finally when I sat down to write it, I didn't know where it was going to go.
Sure.
And almost every time I would have an option. It's like, do I go here or do I go to this like darker place? And I
Mhm.
kept going to the darker place,
Right, right, right.
so which might be against some of my normal instincts, but I was just like, let's just keep going. Let's just see how far this is going to go.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. And that, that's one of the things, is that I'm a fan of literary fiction as well. We don't publish it. And a lot of it is oftentimes to me, okay, that nothing else. To me, it tends to be very well written from a good voice, well technically written, and kind of boring. That's
Yeah.
to me how a lot of it comes across. But then the difference between literary fiction and pulp is, Raymond Carver writes a story about, the English professor uh, and his marriage falling apart, and it's riveting and it's well written. But as soon as you include a dead body in the backyard, all of a sudden it's pulp. you know?
Right.
And that's kind of, that little change all of a sudden is kind of a big dynamic in the story. And so talk to me how, because the majority of the things that you've written to this point have been what would be considered literary fiction for the most part. Uh, and then you put out the Pin Butterfly. You tried 20 years ago to write that crime novel. It didn't quite work out. So talk to me about the transition from literary fiction to crime fiction or pulp or whatever you want to call
Yeah. So I mean, I've always put like a large stock in the entertainment value of literary fiction because I agree with you. I've judged lots and lots of contests. I was like a preliminary judge one year or maybe 2 years in a row, a glutton for punishment for the AWP contest for the book
it. Uh-huh.
manuscript contest. And what would happen is that I would get these manuscripts that were exactly like you described,
Mm-hmm.
well written,
Mm-hmm.
nothing really wrong with them. but also like forgettable as soon as I finished reading them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was always out of like a group of 100 manuscripts. One would pop up where I could push all the others aside and I could say, this is the one that I can forward on to the main judge. Or maybe there might be two out of 100.
Hmm.
And that's about right. That seems about right to me. But it's like, that's one of the things I always kind of focus on when I was writing literary fiction, which is that it's got to be entertaining too. It can't just be, for me at least. So I always think about my parents and especially my mother. My mother had an eighth grade education. She didn't read a lot of stuff, but she was incredibly smart.
Hmm.
And if I had given her some sort of, something that was like some very self-indulgent piece of writing, she would have just like tossed it. So I always think about her as like as an audience where it's like,
Thanks. Yeah.
she was smart, and yeah, I mean, she died when I was pretty young, but I had just begun writing short stories, and I gave her some stories, and she was very insightful about it, like identifying characters that were basically fill-ins for my father that I didn't realize were my father, or picking up little things like that.
Sure.
So I always think like I would do somebody like her a disservice if I just wrote something that was like pretty but of no substance. And uh, so I think as far as like the leap from literary fiction to crime fiction for me, so it was during the pandemic. It was the beginning of the pandemic, and I was like kind of at my wit's end in terms of like projects and what to do. And then I thought, well, now I actually have the time. I can sit down and try to do it again, try to write the crime novel. And
Sure.
what happened, I wrote a crime novel that I like. I think I'm happy with it, except it just read like my other fiction, but with a little more crime in it.
Right. Yeah.
Just, that's not really, if I'm going to go out, try to get a new agent, try to get a publisher, I want to do something kind of bigger, something that's different than what I've done before, something that's, uh, I was thinking of certain Nordic noir novels, these kind of big stories, this very dark and complicated situation, complicated plot. And so
Mhm.
that's what I shot for with the Pin Butterfly. But I do think I mean it's there is more kind of machinations in terms of the plotting in something like that than in say some of my previous novels.
Yeah, I get that.
And I think the other thing is that I I had another thing. There was one other thing. um, I mean, I didn't. I wanted it to. I still wanted it to feel like it was a novel I had written, but I also wanted people to read it in real and see that it was like doing something completely different than what I had done
Sure.
before. And so, but the other thing is like my literary fiction. If you look at it, crime is always on the periphery.
Hmm.
So I feel like I was always kind of skating around it anyway.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and one of the things that really sparked my interest in crime writing or in the genre, I'd read Jim Thompson and a bunch of other people, but I was asked to teach a crime. It was a history of the American crime novel, or the history of the American crime story. It was a summer class at the University of Wisconsin, and the professor had fallen ill, and they couldn't get anyone to take over the class. So they called me up, and I was living in Iowa City then, so I drove up in the middle of the night,
Wow.
walked to class with no prep, having no idea even what the syllabus was.
Wow.
They were, I think I showed them just so I could have a day to catch up. I showed them the Maltese Falcon, the
Uh-huh.
movie, and then I said, tomorrow we're going to hit the ground running. But I stepped into that syllabus, and that's when I began. I discovered Chester Himes. I
Mm,
discovered like other
great.
writers I hadn't read before, and so that kind of really ratcheted up my interest in wanting to do that. And that was like 1998, so it takes me a while to get around to it. But
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's cool. So I wanna touch on one thing that I don't know, I haven't mentioned this yet. I don't think maybe I did. But um John Keir is the author of now either 19 or 20 books, depending on how you consider the Book of Ralph. And that's a lot. I mean, seriously, that's a lot of books. And most people that will be watching this and things like that, would probably aim for half that as being pretty excellent in what they could do. And yet yours has been a journey where you've gone from agent to agent, from publisher to publisher, and all that kind of stuff. So talk to me a little bit about kind of the journey that, this 1920 books has taken, and also, so first off, talk to me about that. But secondly, talk to anybody out there who, is sitting there going, gosh, how do you do this? How do you maintain this for that long and have to hopscotch your way through multiple publishers and, continually trying to find interest in a project or a book, and what advice you might have for them?
Yeah. So when I first started doing this, when I was an undergrad, when I first had an interest in it, I kind of, the career that I thought I would have is not the career I have. You
Sure.
know, I had thought, oh, I'll find one publisher, I'll be with that publisher. It'll, back then, or maybe it was already over with by that time, writers would be given a chance, like maybe their first three books wouldn't sell well,
Right.
but a publisher would be banking on like, oh, their breakout book might be their fourth book or their fifth book.
Hmm.
And that happened with some of my teachers. Somebody like John Irving, his first three novels sold maybe 1,000 copies each or something.
Yeah, that
And
that
then,
that didn't happen after about the 80s.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, so you get like one, maybe two chances now.
Hmm. Yep.
In my case, I had two chances because I had a two-book deal with
Hmm.
a with a imprint of Simon and Schuster. But you know, I had two choices. I give up, or I keep trying to reinvent myself in terms of, finding somebody who would continue publishing my work. I have I've published, I think, 5 or 6 books with University of Iowa Press. They do a lot of my nonfiction stuff, so I feel like I have a home there if I have a book that
Sure.
fit that. And even the last book I did with them, I didn't really think it might be a book for them, but I gave it to the publisher I had been working with, and she's like, "Oh yeah," she's like, I absolutely give you a contract for this," and so we worked something out. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I mean, I just keep trying. I don't think about it in advance. I try to write the best book I can, and it's like the audience. I let the audience find it in the sense that um, it may be a book. And I know with some books I've written, I knew in advance they would have very small audiences. I didn't
Sure.
I didn't dream as I was working on the book that it would be a Random House book or something like that.
Right.
It's like it's published, it'll be kind of an interesting little uh, odd book that some people might be entertained by. But I didn't have like. On the other hand, I did have big expectations for the Pin Butterfly,
Hmm.
and that ended up just being kind of an interesting I think experience that kind of made me question like if I wanted to keep going. And what had happened was it was under contract. I don't know how much you want me to go into this.
No, go into it, please.
So I mean, I had planned on like I spent like the time while I was working on it putting together a list of agents that I wanted, going to Publishers Marketplace, seeing what kinds of books they were selling, looking very specifically for a very certain specific kind of international thriller. Um, and so I felt like I'd done my due diligence, and I did. One of those agents took me on very quickly, sold the book to Mysterious Press within maybe about a week or so. Otto Penzler was the acquiring editor, and I was thrilled. I was like, oh, this is what I was hoping to happen with the book. At a certain point, once the book was wrapping up, that's when I began kind of planning, thinking about like, what would be who would be good for this book, and so I was excited by that. But then the book was handed down to somebody else to edit, who I don't think really liked the book. Then there was some over there, or somebody from inside the company was elevated to Otto's position, and I just had a bad feeling. I just thought, and I remember
Right.
talking to my saying, I don't know if I don't know if they're ever actually gonna publish the book.
Okay.
and, and sure enough, they canceled it. So when I turned in the final draft after, I think it was maybe the third draft of the book that I had done for them, I busted my ass. I really worked hard. I tried to do, you know, keeping the things that things I would fight for, but I tried to be as easy to work with as possible, and as compromising things that I felt comfortable compromising with. Anyways, it got rejected. I think the thing that was the kind of gut punch was how cavalier everybody was about it. Like, yeah, we're not going to publish it, or yeah, we're going to have to cancel this because we have another book about Thailand. That was actually what was, and it was true. They had another book about Thailand that the other person had acquired without knowing about my book, and I just thought, God damn, I worked 2 years like just on with just them, not counting the time it took to actually write the book. And and my agent was like, "Well, we've already sent it to everybody the first time out, so we can't really send it to anybody else because everybody's already looked at it." It's like, well, yeah, but that's why we went with the first offer. Anyways, it just became a disaster. So that's why I brought it out myself. And I there's a lot about that process that I really like,
Mm-hmm.
but it also, it's hard to get word out about a book.
Of course. Oh, always. That's
Yeah. So
without
that's
question.
that's the tug of war where it's like it's um I you know I think I've done a lot. I've done some other podcasts, and I've tried to promote it as much as I can, but it's just difficult. It's difficult to get your friends to buy your book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of, coming from a publisher's perspective, okay, not a writer's, because I do both of them, obviously. From publisher's perspective, it becomes very difficult because the deal that they want you to make, if you're even lucky enough to get the offer, the deal that they want you to make is to sell your label or books or brand or whatever it is to a very large distributor. But the problem is if you do that, it's fantastic because all of a sudden all your titles get in every single bookstore. They're going to be in every Barnes and Noble. They're going to be in, all over the place. They're going to get advertisements. They're going to get all that stuff. Problem is, if you do that, you essentially get pennies on the dollar as a publisher for the books that you made, which is kind of weird. You know what I mean? So it's this constant push and pull because you want to get it out there, but the difficulties of getting it out there is something that you very much have to compromise a lot if you want that. And so as an independent author, putting out your own book, it's even harder because at least with like our label, we can put it out under our little umbrella and our logo and things like that, and there's some kind of an audience there. But as an independent author, it's just straight up your name. You know what I mean? That's it. It's just, John McNally, buy this book. And that's hard. I mean, it's really difficult to do that. And you're right though, there are a lot of benefits to it. You know what I mean? There are a lot of ways that you have creative uh choices that you get to make in the process that you wouldn't get to make under a label, which are nice. But, then you have to deal with pubbing your own book and you know all of the difficulties that come with it. So yeah, I 100% understand, man. um Talk to me real quick about the difference. You've got a whole bunch of books out under John McNally, and then you have a pen name for this one. Now, obviously, it's a little different in genre, so that could very easily be why. But I know that a lot of writers out there either have pen names or toy with the idea of pen names. Obviously, King had Richard Bachman for years, while he was also writing Stephen King stuff. And there's a lot of others, out there as well. So talk to me about the process behind that. And has there been any kickback? Has it been difficult, anything like that? Or has it been pretty smooth?
So when Mysterious Prep, or actually when I first approached my agent about it, I told him I was interested in having a pen name, and really it was just to differentiate the genres.
Okay.
That was really my primary interest. It was just that, oh, if somebody thinks that they're just going to be buying a book of a literary novel. This is not what that is. And because I was also thinking about like that this is really the direction I want to go now, is just writing crime fiction. I kind of it was also psychological in terms of just kind of having this break of
Okay.
saying I'm kind of I'm kind of putting the literary fiction behind me and I'm moving in this other direction. And I do have one more book of literary fiction, but it's a new and selected stories.
Hmm.
And that I feel is like just kind of like a summation of my career as a short story writer
Sure. Sure.
and that'll be under my name. But yeah, the plan was from this point on to just have this pen name. But my agent was like, you should make use of your name because you already have these books, you've had people who've bought them and things like that. So it
Well,
never
and see, John, the difficulty, especially if you're going to put something out independently, comes from it's not John McNally,
right.
it's Johnny Mack, right? Which isn't a name people know. If they look that up, they're not going to automatically make the association. So that makes it more difficult too in terms of a selling point, right? I mean,
Yeah. So I mean, I've had mixed feelings since. I mean, I've thought about just going ahead and reissuing it with my name on it.
okay,
But I think one of the things is so I mentioned that I have two other uh, thrillers
yeah,
that
yeah,
I'm wrapping up. So I mean, if one of those gets published, I mean, they're presses that I really do like, and if one if they get picked up or one of them gets picked up by one of those presses, I would. I mean, it's a conversation I would have with them about that. I think, because I like the idea of having this kind of separation. And I kind of like, personally, I like the kind of psychological separation of
okay,
it. Um, but at the end of the day, if having my name on it, it's going to sell more copies, I would go ahead and do that. So,
right, yeah. No, I get it. It's a conundrum. Uh, yeah, I know that when the psychological aspect you mentioned is interesting because I know that with King, he always mentioned that with Richard Bachman, for whatever reason, he always felt like he could go darker
mhm.
with his pen name than he would with his real name, which is funny because, he's generally regarded as kind of this, devious master of horror, but he actually considers the Bachman books to be much darker than a lot of the stuff he writes in his own name. And that's it is interesting how the psychological aspect plays into that,
Yeah. And I also just like the idea of, somebody like Donald Westlake who wrote under a bunch of different names, but
Yeah.
then you have the Richard Stark
Richard
novels.
Stark, yeah, of course.
And I just there's something about that, and I think also because the novels I'm working on are all set in Southeast Asia. They have they have a different vibe. There's a different sensibility in a way than my previous work. So in that sense, it's like I do even if there's not a crossover of characters, I feel like they're kind of a piece. And so that was another reason of kind of thinking of like, oh well, somebody maybe if I wrote other kinds of crime fiction, I would have a different pen name
Mhm.
for that. But yeah, I can't tell if I've shot myself in the foot or not with the self publishing.
Well,
Wouldn't be by I mean,
right. I do want to point out that to anybody that's watching this that I John just talked about a difficult experience in publishing, and um, I talk to authors regularly, whether it's on these podcasts, which obviously we do a decent amount of, but then just also at book fests and at the Boucher cons and all that kind of stuff, and it's in oh, and then I have a whole bunch of people too that that I speak with that are somehow Hollywood adjacent, right? And we both know that getting a project done in Hollywood is, I mean, there's about everything sounds good at the first hurdle, and then there's like 19 more hurdles you need to get through before anything actually gets done. And those kind of stories are out there. So if you are sitting there going, how can I get this done? Or look, John's published 20 books and he had somebody say, "Yeah, no, we're not going to do this," after they had already agreed to it. So the point is that you got to stay flexible. You have to stay flexible, and if you want it enough, be resilient, and you'll do it. But the point is that sometimes even when everything looks good, it doesn't work out, and that's just that's just the way it works. It's unfortunate, but it's just the way it works. The I want to talk real quick about obviously you've got a very kind of varied background compared to some of the authors we have on here who are very strictly crime, horror, sci-fi, whatever it might be for a long time. With your background in literary fiction and now in crime fiction as well, I want you to talk a little bit about you've been around for a while doing this stuff and talk to me about some of your influences when it comes to not just literary fiction, but crime fiction as well, and kind of the, elements that you take from certain authors. And I don't mean take in terms of you use their style. I mean things that you look at and go, "Ooh, that's really interesting. I could, potentially use that," or "I like that idea. I could do that." So talk to me a little bit about your influences over the years.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I didn't start reading very much until I was in college. I mean, I was a big movie person.
Uh-huh.
A lot of my
I was too.
Yeah, a lot of my influences began from just even though I grew up without very much, not a lot. My parents didn't have a lot of money. We went to the drive-in once a week. That was something we always did. So one of the first movies I ever saw was Bonnie and Clyde.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And just kind of genre in general was I just breathed it, would breathe it in. Whether it was watching creature features, the Universal horror movies at night,
Ah, heck yeah.
or kung fu movies, whatever it was. I just loved it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I was in college, then that's when I it's right, it was right around the time when Raymond Carver and Tobias Wolff and those guys
Yep.
were really getting a lot of attention. And I remember reading Raymond Carver, like the first few stories, I was just like, what happened? Like, nothing's happening. Like, what's happening? And then sort of clicking into it and being like, because the first professor of mine first began giving me all the kind of postmodern stuff from the 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and John Barth and
Yeah.
Donald Barthelme. And I would read that and I would think like, oh, this is what I should be liking. Is this what I should be writing? These kind of metafiction and all this experimental stuff. And then it was a relief when I began reading Raymond Carver and Tobias Wolff and those writers, or Flannery O'Connor, and or even Gabriel.
They're much more grounded, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was closer to my experience.
Yeah.
So it was. Then I got it. Then I was sort of like I kind of but in my writing I became very imitative of that right at first.
Sure.
But probably we talked about this a little bit right before taping. It's kind of like the books you like versus the books that you draw from.
Sure.
Like probably am more drawn to as a reader, Gabriel Garcia Marquez or somebody like
mm-hmm.
the
he's actually a wonderful example, by the way, of somebody I would put in that category where I love his fiction.
Yeah.
I have no interest in writing that fiction, and I doubt I could.
Yeah, no.
But it's phenomenal to read. It's wonderful. I just,
Yeah. Yeah. Or Kafka, or I mean, there are a handful of writers like that I absolutely love.
Mm-hmm.
But back to Carver, I kept coming back to a lot of those writers. And then probably one of the biggest influences for me, one of my favorite writers is Richard Yates, who wrote Revolutionary Road.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I love it, and this is kind of how I think I try to incorporate it, which is that every sentence of Revolutionary Road I can pause and appreciate, but it never takes me out of the story. I'm always invested in the story. It's not self-conscious writing,
mm-hmm.
and yet I'm appreciative of the aesthetic of it.
Sure.
In a way that really, and that's sort of how I feel about Graham Greene, where like every once in a while I hit a sentence from like just like, wow, like that's just a beautiful sentence. It's a great, but it's also just a beautiful sentence. And I think that's what I kind of try to harness when I'm writing, where I'm like, I'm looking for those moments where it all kind of comes together in that way, where somebody can pause and be like, oh, like this is a nice passage, but it's not like me just trying to show off.
Right. Well, there's always that balance, right? Because there's always this balance between writing something that you hope ultimately will be entertaining for somebody, but then there's also a level of, as you mentioned, aesthetics to it, where you're also hoping that another writer looks at it and goes, "Oh wow."
Yeah.
And that there's that balance where you want it to be enjoyable and entertaining for the reader, but at the same time, have somebody kind of take notice and be like, "Oh, okay, I see that." You know what I mean? That's really well done. I appreciate that. And and that's a hard thing to do. It's a and quite frankly, I think that's part of the literary quote unquote aspect of it, because a lot of straight up, strictly pulp fiction writers over the years, and I'm talking, guys that published in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they published, 60, 70 stories, and they use pseudonyms and pen names and everything else. They didn't worry about that.
Right.
They just told a story, and they did it well. Don't get me wrong. And some of them are very much remembered, but the literary aesthetics of it, not always the best,
Right.
Um,
And that's why Jim Thompson is so great because he does both. I mean, it's like he wrote quickly, he
yes,
wrote,
he did. Yeah. Yeah.
but you get those moments, you get those sentences, or you get those passages where you're just like, wow, like that's just great writing. That's just like it's you're it's it's partly it's how you channel the character too. And somebody like him who The Killer Inside Me or some of the other books where it's like he's channeling the character so well.
Oh, the sheriff in Pop 1280 too.
Yeah, no, yeah,
Man,
that's my favorite books.
yeah,
Uh,
he's such a day.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's trying to find, I think, like those moments that kind of transcend. I mean, one of my favorite writers is Stuart Dieback, and I always read the story Pet Milk out to my
Huh.
students. Very short story, but what I love about his writing is it's there's a rhythm to it's beautiful to hear out loud. If you read it, it's very plain. It seems on the surface very plain.
Hmm.
There's a musicality to the prose that doesn't call attention to itself. And one time I saw him read his story We Didn't, and I was watching him tap his foot to the sentence to kind of the rhythm of the
Gotcha. Yeah.
and afterwards, I asked him about it, and he's like, yeah, I don't even realize that I'm doing that. He's like, but I am, and I'm like, it's just that it's that interplay between
Yeah.
something sing on the page, but also not not making it purple prose, not making it, it could be very simple. I think it's like Raymond Carver said something like, it's like all you need are the right words to make the sentence sing or something to that effect. I'm
Hmm.
terrible.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, John, I started out in poetry, and so I wrote, well, I mean, I have 3 books of poetry, and then I have a ton of poems that have been published other places that I've never put out in a book anywhere. And I'll do a new and selected poems at some point here with Starlight. But I think that there is something to that because when you start in the poetry world, honestly, what you do is you write a ton, but you go to so many readings. You just do so many readings. And so you do get that. There's a musicality to the, you know, to the, like you said, prose, but in this sense, it would be poetry. But, and I know just like you had, your experience with the 60s writers. I think many of us, I don't know about you, but many of us had our little beat experience, at some point or another. And so I read, just an absolute ton of Kerouac and O'Hara and Burroughs and Ginsberg and, everybody else. And that stayed with me for a long time, honestly. And they were also guys who I was talking about earlier. They were also guys who could write the hell out of a paragraph but oftentimes they weren't saying a lot.
Mhm. Right.
You know, they made it sound a lot of fun and very interesting, but you know, there's not a lot of there sometimes. But yeah, I just find it so fascinating, man. It's so interesting. I talk to so many writers, and I just I love our species. I think it's so interesting how we get to where we get to from where we start because there's no manual for it. There
Yeah.
isn't. You know, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of books out there for us to read, but there's no manual for it. Everybody takes a totally different, a very kind of fractal path towards where we end up, and I love hearing about it, man. So,
Well,
um,
I was just going to say this. I always try to, especially I work with PhD students now, and I always try to instill in them. I say, you can't think about what your book is going to yield. Like, you can't think of it in terms of like, oh, this is my dissertation, or I need this book to get published. Or it's like, once you begin thinking about what it's going to yield, it
mhm,
becomes a commodity,
mhm.
whether it's going to earn you a degree, whether it's going to get you tenure, whether it's going to, I said, and then it's so hard to like, to do the art, the job, the art of it, which
Yeah.
is writing the damn book.
And
Um,
and that's what I was talking about earlier when you had mentioned writing the Ralph stories even after the book had been published, just because you wanted to write them. It's the same thing. As soon as you put that expectation on it, oh, well, this needs to, be in the Atlantic, or this needs to be in, Esquire, or else this is as soon as you do that, it loses a fundamental aspect of what it was supposed to be. And,
exactly.
you know, ultimately you just have to write it.
Yeah. I mean, my first breakthrough short story was after I finished my MFA, and it was the first time in years that I hadn't been in a workshop. And
Oh yeah. Yeah.
like it was night, I was falling asleep. I had a sentence in my head. I wrote it down, and then I had another sentence. I tried writing it down in the dark, and finally I got up back when I had an electric typewriter and go over and I just started like typing the story all night long. And I
Mhm.
felt that story was just like it was that release of not writing for anybody. Like even if you tell yourself I'm not writing for somebody, you're writing for somebody if you're in a workshop or
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
all that pressure is always there.
Yeah. And being that both of us came from MFA programs, or mine was an MPW program at UC, but same thing essentially. And it's so fascinating. The workshopping process is such an interesting thing. You go in there, and it was so funny. I went in there, and I swear over the last like year and a half, I knew exactly there were going to be three or four people at that table that were going to love what I wrote. There were going to be three or four that would kind of be nitpicky and things like that. And there would be a couple that would just hate it, and it didn't matter what I was going to bring forward. But it's so funny because I feel like that in a funny way, even though, I did kind of know what was going to happen. I feel like in a funny way, that kind of trial by fire is something that's so important for writers because you really do get this sense of when you're writing it, you have this, kind of weird hope that like, oh, everybody's going to love this. But then the moment you take it in a workshop, you realize that's not the case. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And it's a good thing for writers to learn early, is A, you have to continually work on your craft for sure, always. But then B, even when you do create something that you're really happy with, there's going to be some people that yeah, and that's a really important lesson. I mean, it's like when I thought it was really funny a few years ago when U2 the band put out that one CD, and I forget what it's called. But they put it out and they made it free. It automatically downloaded to everybody's iTunes, um or their Apple phones, and they asked, think it was Bono, they asked him later on what lesson they learned from that, and he said, I never knew how many people hated YouTube. And that's the thing, right? Is that you can be whoever you are, whether it's Stephen King or Cormac McCarthy or U2 or whatever, and there's a lot of people that are just not going to care for your work. Like it's just that simple. Even if you give it to them for free, right? they don't want it. They're not interested. And you have to, as an artist, you have to reconcile that. You have to look at it and go, okay, that's a part of it. I get it, and it's kind of funny and it's kind of cool in a way because you realize that there's a niche for you somewhere. And it also makes you appreciate the hell out of the people that do like your stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I go into I'm always. I think the older I get, the more stunned I am when people, if I get like an email from somebody who happened to read something of mine, or a review on Amazon or something. I'm like, it's just so, first it's just the whole process. It's like somebody has to find your work, somebody
Mhm.
has to take the time to read it,
Yeah.
somebody will like it, then they have to take the time to respond,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
all that to me is like I just become so appreciative of any of that.
100%. 100%. I just had a guy email me the other day. I just thought I thought it was hilarious and I appreciated it. He sent me an email at the Starlight Pulp address. He had bought and read Outlaw Ballads and he told me how much he liked it. And then he went on a 2 paragraph rant about all the things that were wrong with it.
Yeah.
And and I emailed him back just like the next day. I'm like, oh my gosh, first off, I just appreciate the hell out of the fact that you read the book and that you took the time to be this detailed about it. And then I was, and then some of the things he had said aren't a big deal to me. They're, kind of a nomenclature, kind of phrasing things from that time, from the 50s and stuff. And I said, I don't worry a whole lot about that. But then he brought up a couple of facts that were just straight up wrong from 1951. And I'm like, well, thank you for that. I'll adjust that as we move forward. But it's like you said, just the fact that somebody read the book, appreciated the book, took the time to write this and give me some feedback and then open themselves up too, because as well as I do, we both know a lot of writers. Some people would look at that and be so angry.
Oh yeah.
And to me, it's like, nah, I didn't live in 1951. I'm trying to figure out too. You know what I mean? I'm trying to get it right. So I appreciate the feedback and thank you. Um, but yeah, it's the same thing. It's amazing, but it's like you said, it's kind of awe-inspiring in a way because you realize the amount of energy that this other person put into your work, which is cool.
Yeah, some of my favorite readers are where I grew up. I used to do a lot of promotion back where I would give signings there was a local Italian beef place that I used to go to as a kid. And so I talked to the owner about giving signings there. And those were probably some of the most successful signings I had
Sure.
because I usually get a little publicity around it. But it was a lot of people who come up to me and say, like, I haven't read a book since high school. I haven't but this was really cool because I recognized all the places or whatever. But my favorite person was this guy who came up. I think he was a UPS driver. And he's like, man, he's like, I love this book. He's like, except that last like 100 pages. He's like, what the hell? He's like, that was terrible. And I was just like, can I
Right.
give you a man?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
King
honesty.
has always said that he had the reputation. I don't know if he does now anymore, but he had the reputation for, probably 20, 30 years that he couldn't finish a book. Everybody would just complain about his endings, right? They'd be like, "Oh, I love the first 350 pages. The last 50 sucked," you know. And again, it goes back to what people want, what people expect, and the artistic aspect of it, where sometimes you write a book and you think what people might want there, and you don't want to give it to them. you know,
Yeah.
because the narrative and the characters don't lend themselves to that. So it's got to end a different way, and it's going to make some people unhappy, and okay. But then you're going to get a lot of people saying, "Yeah, that sucked." Uh, but yeah, I think that's awesome, and yeah, it's always nice to kind of go home in a way, you know. And like you said, it's hard for your friends to even buy your books. I mean, my one of my very best friends forever. I mean, I've known him since he's 12 years old. I don't think he's read a book since middle school. He's certainly not going to read my books. You know what I mean? Like he buys our t-shirts
Yeah.
stuff like that. He supports it, but he's not going to read. There are readers out there. We both know them. There's readers out there, and there's a lot of people that don't read at all, and that I mean, and they're even in our lives, and that's okay. I mean, you know. if they wrote a book on, the PhD dissertation that got turned into a book on philosophical musings, I probably wouldn't read it either. You know, it's
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I never hold anything against like,
yeah,
somebody and when I give books to people, friends of mine, I always tell them like don't feel like you have to read it. Like it's like I'm giving it to you because it's there. Whatever. It's if you do read it, you might appreciate some this little thing here or something. But yeah, I had old older like one of my oldest friends who was like getting rid of all of his books recently, and I happened to be at his house, and I saw like my books in the stack to get rid of. I just thought, wow, that's cold, man.
yeah. You can't even hang on to those, huh? Okay. All right, man. Well, this is we're gonna end here. John, it's been a blast. Thanks for coming on. So this is the most recent book from John, the Book of Ralph, which is actually the same Book of Ralph that was published 20 years ago, but with 150 additional pages, a new introduction, and some other stuff. And it's quite thick, as you can see. In fact, I just want to point out that both of these books really not small, John. These are not little books. No. And then the Pin Butterfly is the one that was put out in late 23. That's the crime fiction book. And I also want to point out that our most recent book, American Muse, John had a blurb for that as well, which I very much appreciate. So anyways, thank you guys for checking in, and hope you guys got something out of this. These are a blast for us to do. So I hope that you guys take something from it. And thanks so much for checking in.
All right, thanks, Brian.
You got it.
In this topsy turvy